Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The sky above the New Mexico territory carried a heavy, steel gray weight, the kind that made ranchers glance at their roofs and animals shift restlessly in the pens. Dust ran across the yard in narrow streams, slapping against the side of the farmhouse and settling in the cracks of weathered boards. The farm was worn but standing, fences leaning in places, the barn door hanging uneven on its hinges, tools scattered in the yard where they'd been left when Clara Mayfield's body had finally refused to go further. Clara stood in the doorway, one hand bracing against the frame, the other pressing into her hip. Her body betrayed her again, just as it had since the accident. Months had passed since the runaway horse threw her down hard enough to leave her legs weak and stiff, but the pain remained, dull and constant, sharper whenever she tried to move fast or far. She hated needing to rest, hated the way her chores piled up, posts rotting, ditches clogging, goats breaking through weak boards. Once, she had been strong, a rancher's daughter who could handle herself without waiting for anyone's help. Now, every step reminded her that strength was gone. She scanned the horizon with a mix of suspicion and caution. A figure was coming down the track, riding slow, reins loose. The horse moved with tired steps, ribs pushing in and out, its hide marked by miles of trail dust. The rider was a man, broad-shouldered but lean, his hat pulled low to block the grit blowing off the plain. He looked like every drifter she'd ever heard about in town, a man with no ties, no plans, just a horse and a saddle blanket for a bed. Her first thought was that he might be trouble. A stranger on a worn horse meant a man who had been moving too long without rest. She didn't want company, not from neighbors, and especially not from a stranger. But the sky behind him was building with low thunder, the storm fast enough that even a cautious woman couldn't deny it would hit soon. The cowboy slowed near the gate, reined in, and looked toward the trough without speaking. His silence was heavy, not rude, not desperate, just steady. Clara felt her throat tighten with old fear. If she let him closer, she risked showing weakness. But another thought pressed in. If she turned him away, she'd be known as the bitter woman who closed her door on a man needing water and shelter from the weather. Pride and practicality fought inside her chest until practicality won. She jerked her chin toward the trough. Water's there. Pump works if you don't yank it. The man dismounted without a word. He led the gelding forward, shoulders rolling stiff under his coat. His movements were deliberate, the kind of careful that comes from a man who has seen enough fights to know sudden gestures get you shot. He pumped water, filled the trough, and let the horse drink deep. All the while, Clara studied him, trying to read whether he was just passing through or weighing the place for weakness. When the first drops of rain began to strike the porch roof in sharp taps, the man tied off his horse and turned toward her. He still hadn't spoken. His quiet unnerved her more than if he'd come with smooth words. Men who talked too much were easy to read. Men who said little carried things they didn't want to share. Finally, he spoke in a voice low and flat. Just a place to wait out the rain. Won't trouble you long. Clara's stomach nodded. She didn't want him inside. Yet the storm was already turning the yard to mud, and she couldn't well send him off without looking cruel. And if she forced him back out, there was no telling whether that would stir resentment she couldn't defend herself against. Her legs wouldn't let her fight. Not anymore. She moved aside. Don't touch what ain't yours. He stepped through the doorway with a simple nod. Inside, the house smelled faintly of soap and boiled beans. He paused near the center of the room, hat still in hand, boots leaving damp marks on the floor. Clara leaned on the jamb, pain buzzing in her hips as she shifted her weight. They didn't trade names right away. The storm filled the silence, rattling windows and running down the roof in sheets. Clara's nerves stayed sharp, watching him, judging every quiet glance at her kitchen, her table, the half-mended tools stacked near the wall. She hated the weakness of needing anyone to see her house like this, with work half finished, the kind she used to do before the accident. But then her eyes caught the pail by the door, unmilked, the shovel left in the half-dug ditch, the stack of boards waiting for nails. The place showed itself for what it was. Too much work for one woman who couldn't bend without pain. The cowboy noticed it too, though he said nothing at first. When the storm slowed to a drizzle, he looked at the fence line through the open window and finally spoke. "That post won't last the week." Clara bristled, ready to snap back, but stopped. He wasn't judging, only stating fact. She set her jaw. "If you feel like fixing something, there's the shovel. But don't expect more than a meal for it." The man gave the smallest nod, like the deal was fair. He picked up the shovel, turned his shoulders into the work, and began. For the first time in months, Clara felt a pull of something she hadn't let herself think about: relief. The storm passed, leaving the air damp and cool, the dirt in the yard sticking to boots and hooves. Elias Boone worked the shovel into the ditch until the water drained steady, the sound of mud sliding away filling the space between them. Clara stood on the porch, arms folded across her chest, her weight balanced carefully because too much time on her left leg would set her hip throbbing. She watched him not as a curious woman, but as someone measuring a stranger. What he could do, how he carried himself, whether he meant to leave or stay past the point of welcome. He worked with a rhythm she recognized from men who had spent years on trail crews. The shovel cut clean, his back bent without waste, no unnecessary movement. It struck her that he wasn't showing off. Most men in these parts, if given the chance to help a woman alone on a ranch, would puff their chests, talk loud, expect thanks before the job was half done. This one said nothing, asked for nothing. He just worked. Clara's eyes narrowed. She thought of the questions any neighbor would ask if they saw him here. Who was he? Where did he come from? Was he running from something? Out here, a quiet man could be a blessing or a danger. She felt the old edge of fear she'd lived with since her fall, the fear of being defenseless. Yet she also felt the steady calm of seeing the ditch done right, the kind of work she hadn't been able to finish in months. When he set the shovel aside, she spoke, her voice carrying both command and hesitation. "Water will run clear now. That keeps the barn floor from flooding." He wiped his sleeve across his brow. "Needed doing." Clara waited. She knew she had to ask, and so did he. "Name?" "Elias Boone." His tone was clipped, final. She nodded slowly, still leaning on the doorframe. "Clara Mayfield. This is my place." Her voice tightened at the last word. My place. She wasn't about to let him or anyone think she couldn't claim it anymore. The silence after gave her time to weigh would have been left unsaid in their first meeting. Why was a man like him on this road? Why her place? She decided to ask directly, tired of circling. "What's your trail, Boone?" Men don't wander this far south without reason. He pulled at the cuff of his sleeve, his eyes lowering briefly to the dirt. "Family's gone. Been gone near 10 years. I take work where I find it. Keep moving." The way he said it left little room for questions, but Clara heard what wasn't spoken. She saw the scar of loneliness in his eyes, the kind that came from burying more than one person. She wanted to press, but something in her told her not to push a man who had lost that much. She understood loss in her own way. Her body had taken her independence, her pride, her place among her neighbors. Asking more of him now felt like asking more than she herself was willing to give. Instead, she gestured toward the broken fence line where posts sagged like drunks in the dust. "If you're set on earning your supper, the north stretch won't hold goats another week." Elias followed her gaze. "I'll set them straight. Need a hammer and nails." She brought a tin with bent nails she'd saved, placing it down on the porch rail with stiff fingers. The simple motion lit pain in her hips. She hated that he saw it, hated the weakness in her stagger, hated herself for the flush that rose in her cheeks. She covered it with a hard tone. "That's what's left. Make it work." He didn't flinch at her sharpness, just took the tin, tested a nail, and carried the post to the line. She stood close enough to watch, but far enough to feel in control. The sound of the mallet striking filled the afternoon, steady, firm, exact. No wasted effort. While he worked, her thoughts moved fast. If he stayed too long, what would people say? If he left at dawn, could she manage the next chore alone? She thought of neighbors like Mrs. Hollis, who carried flour and gossip in equal measure. They would want to know why a stranger worked her fences and why she let him. The truth was simple, because she needed it. But saying that out loud would feel like admitting defeat. By the time the sun fell low, the fence stood straighter than it had since before her fall. Clara felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in months, relief that wasn't tainted by shame. He finished the last post, tamped the soil firm, and brought the hammer back to her without asking for thanks. She looked at him long enough to see more than his silence. This was a man carrying grief like a weight strapped to his back. She recognized it because she carried her own. He had no mission beyond surviving, and she had no mission beyond keeping her land alive with a body that failed her daily. Different battles, same emptiness. That night, she set a pot of stew on the table, watery and plain, but a meal all the same. He ate without complaint, and she studied him across the dim light of the lantern. Each bite he took gave her time to think. What would tomorrow bring? Would he ride on, leaving her to the chores she couldn't finish? Or would he stay one more day, enough to fix the gate or patch the shed? She realized with a start that the thought of him leaving unsettled her more than it should have. When the bowls were cleared, he carried his bedroll outside to the lean-to without being told. Clara stood in the doorway, watching as he settled down, the lantern light spilling faint across the yard. She felt the familiar pull of doubt and fear. Fear of needing someone again, fear of trusting a stranger, fear of waking to find him gone. But for tonight, the fence was strong, the ditch clear, and she was not alone in the silence. Dawn came with a pale red streak over the horizon, the kind that meant a dry morning and hard ground underfoot. Clara woke early out of habit, though the pain in her hips reminded her again that she would never rise from bed as quickly as before. She sat on the edge of the mattress, breathing through the stiffness, her jaw clenched while her legs adjusted to wait. She hated the ritual of it, waiting for her own body to cooperate. Once, she had pulled on boots and been out the door before the roosters crowed. Now, she needed minutes she never used to spend, and those minutes carried shame. Outside, she heard Elias Boone already at work. The scrape of a shovel against soil, the steady thud of boots moving across the yard. He had chosen not to ride out at dawn, as most drifters did. That unsettled her in ways she couldn't put into words. Men like him never stayed, at least not in her experience. They came, worked a day, and left before anyone asked where they came from or what they were running from. But here he was, still there. She moved carefully into the kitchen, leaning on the table as she fetched oats for herself and for the horse tied near the trough. Elias appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, sweat already dampening his shirt at the collar. He didn't ask if he could come inside. He just stepped in slow, the way men did when they were mindful of someone else's space. Clara noticed that. She also noticed he kept his voice low, as if aware that loud talk made her tense. The kitchen door, he said, tapping the hinge with one finger. Loose screw. Caught my shoulder when I came in. Clara blinked, surprised he mentioned it. That door had dragged for months. She told herself she'd fix it, but hadn't managed. The head's stripped, she said flatly, her pride stinging at the thought that he noticed something she couldn't mend. He picked up the screw with a look that was neither pity nor judgment. File will cut a new slot. Won't take long. As he set to work, Clara eased herself into a chair near the stove. She watched him work with steady, efficient hands, not wasting motion, not muttering. For the first time, she allowed herself to study him closer. He carried the look of a man who had been through more than most. Lines cut deep at the corners of his eyes, a scar along the back of his wrist that spoke of old fights, a stiffness in his left shoulder when he bent low. She wondered about the cholera he'd mentioned. She hadn't asked who exactly he'd buried, but she guessed it was more than one. A man didn't look like that unless he'd lost everything that tethered him. When the door swung smooth on its hinges, he tested it twice, then looked at her. Better. Clara nodded once. Her throat tightened with the strange mix of relief and humiliation she always felt when someone else fixed what she couldn't. She wanted to tell him to leave, to take his horse in his silence, and ride on before she started expecting him to come back. But another part of her, quieter, heavier, knew she needed him there, even if she hated admitting it. Elias, she said finally, her voice cautious. You work like a man, used to more than drifting. Where'd you learn it? His eyes lowered for a moment, the answer coming slow. Trail crews. Ranches. Did what was needed after the graves were filled. Work keeps a man moving. That answer explained little, but it explained enough. Clara pressed no further. She understood avoidance. She'd been practicing it herself with neighbors, avoiding their visits, their questions, their pity. She shifted in her chair, the ache pressing into her hips again. Elias watched, silent but attentive. Finally, he spoke. A body can stiffen worse if it stays still. Best to move, even when it hurts. Not too much. Just steady. Clara's pride bristled, but beneath it, she knew he was right. Months of avoiding pain had turned her legs to iron rods, unyielding and cruel. And you'd know? She asked, her tone sharp to cover the vulnerability in her question. I've seen it, he said simply. Men broken by saddle falls. Wagon accidents. Some gave up. Some didn't. Clara stared at him, unsettled by the way he spoke. Factual, not soft, not offering sympathy she didn't want. She swallowed and forced herself to admit what she hadn't said to anyone. I can't open my legs without pain. Doctor told me to rest, and resting near ruined me. I don't want to be useless, but I don't know where to start anymore. Elias studied her for a long moment. She thought he might dismiss her words, or worse, pity her. But he only nodded, as if her confession was something ordinary, not shameful. He pulled a straight-back chair to the stove, folded a grain sack for a cushion, and set it down firm. Here, he said, his voice even. Sit. Plant your feet. Hands on the seat. Just tilt your knees apart slow. Don't force it. Don't count time. Count your breath. Clara hesitated. Part of her screamed to throw him out, to refuse this intrusion into something so personal. But another part knew this was more help than she dared ask for since the accident. She sat, stiff and reluctant, and followed his instructions. The movement burned through her hips, sharp and humiliating. But she managed one slow breath, then another. Elias stood back, silent, watching only her face. When she finally stopped, exhausted and trembling, she expected a comment. Instead, he just nodded once. Good. Again later. That was it. No comfort, no empty words. Just a simple plan. Clara found her shoulders lowering, the tension easing from her jaw. For the first time in months, she felt something close to direction, not the drifting fog of helplessness. She leaned back in the chair, catching her breath, and let her eyes meet his. Elias Boone didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose who chose, for reasons she couldn't yet name, to stay one more day. And that was enough for now. The mornings settled into a pattern, though neither Clara nor Elias spoke of it as such. He rose first, boots striking the porch planks before daylight, and she followed when the kitchen smelled of wood smoke. It unsettled her at first. His presence so steady, as if he belonged, but she could not deny the rhythm his work gave to the ranch. The fence lines that had sagged now stood firm. The barn door no longer dragged. The goat shed roof no longer dripped onto the feed sacks. Things that had been broken for months now worked as they were meant to. Clara moved carefully, each step a decision, each bend of her knees a test. The chair near the stove became her station, the folded grain sack her companion. At first, she hated the way Elias hovered, his silence hovering with him. But he did not speak unless she faltered. And when he did, his words were plain and precise. Slow down. Hold the breath. He never once said she was weak. That mattered more than she let on. One evening, after supper, Clara surprised herself by speaking more than she meant to. The lantern's low flame softened the edges of the room, and Elias sat at the table mending a strap, his hand steady. She began with small things: the runaway horse, the winter she thought might end her, the shame of asking a boy half her age to carry in wood. Her voice hardened as she admitted how the rooms of her own house had become distant. I can see the shelf. I can see the fence post, but my body won't let me reach it. And each day it feels further away. She had not told this to anyone else, not even Mrs. Hollis, who pressed advice and pity in equal measure. Elias didn't interrupt. He kept working the strap, his eyes fixed on the leather, as though her words deserved no spotlight, only listening. When she finally quieted, He set down all and spoke. My family died on the trail. Cholera. Father, mother, younger brother. Buried them myself. After that, I didn't stay nowhere long. The words came blunt, stripped of detail, but Clara knew enough. She heard the weight in the shortness of his telling. She wanted to ask more, how old his brother had been, how long he stayed by the graves. But she stopped herself. If he wanted to say more, he would. Silence sat between them again, but it was different this time. Not empty, not hostile, shared. The audience, neighbors, or anyone peering from outside, would likely wonder why Elias didn't simply leave now that the chores were done. Men like him, drifters with nothing to hold them, never stayed in one place unless forced. The answer, though unsaid, lived in the way he began using the word tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll plane those boards. Tomorrow, I'll reset that latch. He didn't say it like a man tied down. He said it like a man testing what it felt like to belong again. Clara noticed. She didn't mention it, but she noticed. By the fourth night, she no longer asked herself if he would be gone at dawn. Instead, she caught herself wondering what else she might ask of him if he stayed. That thought frightened her. It felt like giving up control. Yet, when a lantern was trimmed low and the house sat in quiet, she felt less alone than she had since before the accident. When she thanked him the next day for setting the fence firm, he held up a hand and corrected her. Fence holds because the posts are sound. You do the work in that chair, it's the same. My hands don't change nothing if you don't keep at it. For a long moment, Clara stared at him. No man had ever told her straight like that, without trying to comfort or to flatter. It disarmed her. Her mouth tightened, but her eyes softened despite herself. That night, when the lantern went dark, her thoughts didn't circle with anger at her body. Instead, she lay awake considering the strange comfort of a man who spoke so little, yet left her feeling as though she could try again tomorrow without shame. News traveled faster than wagons in the territory, and word reached the Mayfield place sooner than Clara expected. By the end of the week, Mrs. Hollis rode up in her buggy, the wheels crunching over the dry ruts of the road. She carried a flour sack on the seat beside her, and the kind of look that told Clara she hadn't come only for a visit. Clara braced herself, adjusting her stance at the porch rail so she wouldn't lean too heavily on one side. She despised letting anyone see the careful balancing that pain forced on her. Mrs. Hollis climbed down, lips pressed tight, eyes sharp. Heard tell you about help here. A drifter, someone said. Man working your fences. Her tone hovered between curiosity and warning. Clara kept her voice level. His name is Elias Boone. He's fixing what needs fixing. That's all. Mrs. Hollis sniffed, as if that answer wasn't enough. You're alone out here. Folks talk when a man they don't know takes to staying under your roof. She glanced toward the corral, where Elias had set the gate to swing smooth, his shoulders rolling as he tested the hinge. He didn't look up. He didn't seem to care what she thought. Clara felt heat rising in her face, not from guilt, but from the way pity always dressed itself as advice. If folks want to talk, let them. He works. He earns his supper. That's the end of it. Mrs. Hollis left the flour sack and, softening a little, added a jar of peaches. Doctors in town don't know much about farm women's bodies. Willow bark tea, hot compresses, that's what I'd use if I were you. Her words carried weight, a mix of kindness and a reminder that she saw Clara as broken. Clara accepted the gifts with polite thanks, hiding the sting behind a firm nod. When the buggy rattled away, she leaned against the post for a moment longer than she meant to, her hips burning from the strain of standing so long. Inside, Elias was at the table, straightening nails with a hammer so they could be used again. He didn't ask about the visit. Clara brought the flour into the kitchen and set it down harder than she intended. Neighbors will talk. They'll think I brought you in for more than work. Elias kept his eyes on the nails. People talk. Always have. Won't change the fence. Won't clear the ditch. His calmness made her chest tighten. She wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that simple, but the truth was he was right. The ranch needed work, and if she worried about every word neighbors muttered, the goats would eat through the weak boards and the house would crumble around her. That night, Clara spread the ledger on the table. It had been gathering dust for months because numbers only reminded her of what she couldn't manage. Together, they laid out coins on the cloth and counted. A pair of goats ready for trade. Cured hides. Eggs if the fox stayed away. Elias showed her how to mark the page with neat columns so nothing slipped through. Clara watched his hand steady the pencil, and for the first time in months the ledger didn't feel like a record of failure. It looked like a plan. When the figures were put away, she stood by the bedpost in her room, testing her legs. She widened her stance further than before, holding herself upright with both hands gripping wood. The strain lit fire across her hips, her muscles trembling, but she counted her breaths instead of curses. She stayed with it until her knees gave. Elias didn't see, or if he did, he gave her the dignity of silence. Later, as he unrolled his bedroll by the door, Clara caught herself wondering what tomorrow's chores would be, not whether he would be gone at dawn. The difference startled her. She turned away quickly, unwilling to face what that meant. The audience, if they could ask questions, might press on what Clara feared most. Whether she was losing independence by letting him stay, whether the neighbors' gossip carried more truth than she wanted to admit. But the truth, unspoken yet clear, was simpler. She needed his presence as much as his work, and she was not ready to face the thought of him leaving. The morning broke clear, the ground dry after days of storms. Clara forced herself out of bed quicker than usual, driven by a stubborn need to prove that she was gaining ground. Elias was already outside, splitting kindling in even strokes, the echo carrying across the yard. She hated that her first thought was relief. Relief that he was still there, not gone before daylight. She told herself it was because the goats needed pinning and the corral still leaned. But deep down, she knew it wasn't only about the chores. She moved through the kitchen with sharp determination. Her hands measured oats. Her breath caught as her hip protested, but she pressed on. She told herself she had to test her limits, or else she'd never reclaim her life. The chance came when she saw the pail by the pump, brimming heavy with water. She glanced toward the yard. Elias was busy with the wood. Pride surged hot through her chest. She could carry it herself. She would carry it herself. The moment she lifted, her body betrayed her. The weight pulled her sideways, her left foot slipped in mud, and the jolt threw her shoulder into the ground. Pain cracked through her hip so sharp that her breath came out in a sound she hated, half groan, half cry. Before she could right herself, Elias was at her side, kneeling close but not crowding, his shadow falling over her. Her first reaction was anger, not gratitude. "Damn it," she hissed, fists pressing into the dirt as she forced herself upright. "I can't even carry a pail. I'm useless." The words stung her own ears. They were the words she had feared saying out loud. She saw Elias watching, his jaw tight, his eyes calm but firm. He didn't argue. He didn't soothe. He waited. Finally, when the silence grew heavy, he spoke. "This isn't the end of it. You lost a step. Doesn't mean you don't keep going. One day doesn't break the work." Clara wanted to spit back that he didn't know, that he couldn't feel what she felt. But the steadiness of his voice cut through her panic. The heat of shame softened into something closer to despair. She leaned against the fence post, breathing through the throbbing in her hip. Then the words slipped out, bare and raw. "I can't open my legs without pain. They lock. Every move feels like fire. The shame of it eats me worse than the pain." Her throat tightened. She had never spoken this plainly to anyone. She expected him to look away, to pity her, to walk off. Instead, Elias shifted on his heels, his voice measured. "Tell me what you need." Her heart pounded at the bluntness of the moment. She hesitated, the shame almost choking her. But she had reached the edge of her endurance. "Help me loosen them. Show me how to move them. If you stay, if you don't judge me." Her voice cracked at the last word. He nodded once, no hesitation. "I can do that. We'll start slow. You tell me the second it feels wrong." They moved inside to the chair by the stove. Elias folded the grain sack on the seat, steady and deliberate. Clara sat down, her hands gripping the edge, her body tense. He crouched beside her, his hands hovering until she gave the faintest nod. He placed one hand above her knee to steady, the other against her thigh. not pushing, just grounding. Breathe, he said quietly. Slow. In and out. Tell me when the tightness hits. Clara obeyed, her breath shallow at first, then steadier as she let the movement happen in small arcs. The pain flared, but this time it had shape, it had reason. Elias adjusted her angle, slid a folded towel under her thigh, pressed along the muscles until the rope-like band softened. His touch was clinical, firm, respectful. He watched her face more than her legs, pausing whenever her mouth tightened or her breath caught. Time stretched. Minutes blurred into something that felt longer, but somehow manageable. When he finally pulled back, Clara found her knees apart wider than she had managed in months. The ache was still there, but beneath it was a warmth that surprised her. She realized she was trembling, not from pain now, but from the weight of having asked and having been met without judgment. Elias stood, washed his hands at the basin, and gave her silence instead of commentary. She looked at him, waiting for words that didn't come, and felt something inside her steady. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. For the audience, neighbors, outsiders, anyone wondering. This moment answered what had hung unspoken since the first chapter. How much Clara could let herself trust him, how far Elias would go without crossing the line of pity or presumption. It wasn't just work anymore. It was partnership, fragile and new, but real. That night, when she lay in bed, the pain hummed low in her hips. But for the first time since the fall, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like progress. And she whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, tomorrow. The next day carried the sharp brightness that comes after a night of heavy air. Clara sat by the stove in the same straight-back chair, the grain sack folded beneath her, her palms sweating though the morning was cool. Asking Elias for help yesterday had left her shaken. She had lain awake long after the house quieted, replaying each moment, his hands steady, his silence respectful, his refusal to turn her weakness into pity. Now, facing him again, she felt the same fear stirring. Fear of needing him, fear of what it said about her if she asked again. Elias crouched beside her without prompting. His movements carried no hesitation, no impatience. He asked nothing about yesterday, offered no commentary on how brave or strong she'd been. That silence gave her permission to continue. She nodded once, and he placed his hand above her knee as before, his other hand bracing her thigh. Breathe steady, he said quietly, his voice the same even tone he used when fixing a fence post or setting a hinge. The muscles protested at once, fire shooting through her hips, but she followed his instruction. Slow inhale, slow exhale, and the pain dulled into something she could measure. He adjusted the angle, lifting slightly under her thigh with a folded towel, shifting pressure until her body yielded a fraction more. His touch was firm, practical, never lingering where it shouldn't. He wasn't there to rescue her pride. He was there to work. Her knees parted wider than the day before. Sweat dampened her temples. She clenched her jaw, wanted to stop, then forced herself to stay. Elias watched her face closely, not her legs, pausing the moment her mouth tightened. Hold or stop, he asked. She forced herself to answer. Hold. Time blurred into slow progress. 5 breaths, then 10, then a pause to let the muscles cool. Clara realized the sessions weren't only changing her body. They were reshaping her fear. Each small victory chipped away at the belief that she was ruined forever. Afterward, Elias stepped back, rinsed his hands at the basin, and left her to sit with the ache. He didn't say good job or offer praise. He only gave a small nod, as though acknowledging work completed. She appreciated that more than she could admit. The day unfolded in chores. Elias sawed boards for the porch steps, and Clara steadied them with her foot, testing her balance as she leaned into the work. She carried a lighter pail of water across the yard, slower than she wanted, but she carried it. Elias noticed, she saw in the way his eyes flicked toward her, but he said nothing. That silence felt like trust. By late afternoon, they sat at the table, the ledger open again. Elias suggested trading the skittish mare for a roan gelding, steady and calm, even if the deal cost more than Clara liked. She frowned at the figures, her pride wrestling with practicality, but she knew he was right. A reliable horse would save her from another accident. She marked the column in her careful handwriting, the decision made. As the lantern burned low that night, Clara spoke softly, almost against her will. "Why you stay, Boone? Men like you don't usually linger." Elias was silent for a long moment. His hands rested on the table, scarred and calloused. When he finally answered, his voice was low. "I've spent years leaving before I was asked to. Made it easier that way. But leaving never gave me anything worth keeping. Work here, it feels different." He stopped there, unwilling or unable to say more. Clara studied him, her chest tight. She saw the truth in his eyes, though he hadn't said it outright. Helping her wasn't just mending her fences or easing her pain. It was mending something in him too, something hollow that had been left after the graves he'd buried. For the audience, those watching from the edges of this story, the unanswered question of Elias's past lingered. Why had he chosen this place, this woman, this broken stretch of land? The answer, while still unspoken, had begun to show itself. He wasn't just helping Clara stand again. He was giving himself a reason to stay still for the first time in years. When the lantern went out, Clara lay in her bed with her hips aching in a new way, a tiredness from effort, not from failure. For the first time since the accident, she looked at tomorrow not with dread, but with a flicker of anticipation. And in the lean-to by the door, Elias closed his eyes with a rare sense of quiet, as if the ground beneath him was steady enough to hold him one more night. The next week brought clear skies and longer days. Clara moved with more steadiness now, though every step still carried its reminder. Her hips ached in the evenings, but it was a different ache, earned, not inflicted. She no longer feared stretching in front of Elias. He never mocked, never softened his eyes with pity. His presence made the work bearable. But the ranch wasn't the whole world, and sooner or later the outside had to be faced. Clara knew the neighbors would wonder, just as Mrs. Hollis had, whether the stranger was still at her place. She also knew the ledger's numbers demanded a trip to town. The trade for the roan gelding needed to be made before the mare threw her again, and supplies for planting were running short. The thought of walking the streets with Elias beside her brought both comfort and unease. Comfort because she trusted his quiet strength. Unease because others would see what she hadn't yet admitted out loud, that it had become part of her life. That morning, Elias harnessed the wagon. The mare snorted, restless, and he steadied her with firm hands until Clara came forward. She carried herself with as much dignity as she could, leaning on the cane she'd fashioned from a juniper branch. Every step in the wagon seat was slow, deliberate, but she did it without asking for help. Elias only stood close, ready if she faltered, and that readiness was enough. The road into town was rough, the wheels clattering over stone. Clara kept her jaw tight against the jarring, reminding herself that pain was no reason to hide. Elias drove in silence, eyes scanning the land the way trail men always did. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He fit the wagon seat, as though he'd been there for years, not days. That unsettled her more than she admitted. When they rolled down a main street, heads turned. Clara saw the glances. Men at the blacksmith, women carrying baskets, boys leaning on posts. Their eyes followed Elias first, then shifted to her cane, then back again. She heard the whispers carried low. Mayfield woman's got herself a drifter. Inside the doctor's small office, Clara faced her first real test. She straightened her back, rested both hands on her cane, and spoke in a voice that carried authority she hadn't used in months. "I need clear instructions. Strength, joint care, not just rest." The doctor blinked, surprised at her directness, then set about showing her a few more movements, adding a liniment for warmth. Elias stood at her side, silent, watching carefully. Clara noticed he didn't take over the conversation. He let her lead. That mattered. They left with a sheet of instructions and a small bottle of liniment. Clara felt stronger for having asked the questions herself. On the way out, she caught Elias glancing at the page, reading the doctor's notes with careful eyes. He would remember every word. She was sure of it. The courthouse was next. The taxes and deed papers had weighed on her since spring. She had delayed them because the walk to town had felt impossible. Now, cane in hand, she crossed the wooden floor and signed her name with steady fingers. Elias read the fine print, his jaw tightening when he found a line that needed correction. He pointed it out without fuss, and the clerk fixed it. Clara felt the weight lift. Her land was secure, and she hadn't faced it alone. By the time they returned to the wagon, her legs trembled from use, but her pride held her upright. She caught Elias's eyes on her, not as a man watching weakness, but as one measuring progress. The difference made her throat tighten. That evening, back at the ranch, she opened the jar of peaches Mrs. Hollis had left and placed it on the table. Elias raised his eyebrows, surprised. Clara offered no explanation, only set out plates and cornbread. They ate together in the soft glow of the lantern. For the first time, Clara didn't feel the need to explain herself to the neighbors, to defend Elias's presence, or to justify her own struggles. For the audience, those who might wonder, this answered the questions that had hung in silence since the start. Could Clara still claim her place in the world outside her ranch? Could Elias be trusted when others watched? The day had shown the answer. She was not hiding anymore, and he was not drifting. Whatever they were building, it was real enough to carry into town and back again. When night came and the dishes were cleared, Clara sat by the stove, hips sore but steady, and whispered to herself a word she hadn't spoken with hope in months. Tomorrow. Elias, rolling out his bed by the door, caught the faint sound. He didn't say anything, but for the first time since he'd lost his family, he allowed himself to believe tomorrow might be worth waiting for. Spring deepened, bringing a steady warmth across the New Mexico territory. The Mayfield Ranch, once a place that seemed on the verge of surrender, began to show signs of life again. The ditch Elias had dug ran clear, the fence lines stood straight, and the barn smelled of hay rather than damp rot. Clara, though still moving with caution, found herself doing more each day. She walked the yard with her cane, bent carefully to gather eggs, and even carried half-filled pails when the goats needed water. Each step was deliberate, but they were her steps, not borrowed from anyone else. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Hollis returned one afternoon with her eldest boy to trade eggs for flour. She lingered at the gate, her sharp eyes studying the yard. Clara felt her pride swell when the woman remarked that the ranch looked kept again. It was the first time in months that word had been used about her home. Elias remained quiet, fixing the corral rail as though he hadn't heard. Clara caught herself watching the scene. The woman's suspicion, Elias's silence, her own determination to stand upright despite the ache in her hips, and realized she no longer felt the sting of judgment as sharply as before. Inside, she opened the ledger with Elias at the table. They reviewed the numbers with an ease that surprised her. It no longer felt like tallying debts. It felt like shaping the future. Goats go to market next week, Elias said, his finger tapping the neat column. Barley seeded. If the rains hold, you'll have feed by harvest. Clara nodded, seeing the plan not as a fragile hope, but as something solid. The ranch wasn't simply surviving. It was moving forward. Still, a question lingered. For weeks, she had wondered, why hadn't Elias left? Men like him always drifted on, their boots carrying them to the next stretch of work, the next place where nobody asked about their past. She decided to face it directly one evening as they sat under the dim lantern glow. You could have gone after the fence was fixed, or after the ditch, or after town, but you stayed. Why? Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the strap he was mending, the silence stretching long enough that Clara thought he might not answer at all. Finally, he said, I've been moving 10 years. Thought staying meant weakness, but leaving never gave me anything worth keeping. Here, he paused, his voice catching just enough to betray weight behind the words. Here, the work feels like it matters. Feels like it's not just for passing time. Clara's throat tightened. She knew what he meant because she felt the same. For her, every stretch, every step, every ache had once felt like a reminder of what she'd lost. Now it felt like progress towards something that might last. The next morning, Elias brought home the roan gelding, trading the nervous mare just as he'd advised. Clara led the horse with cautious steps, her hand resting on its neck. The animal lowered its head, calm, steady. She felt a tremor of pride ripple through her. For months, she had avoided the barn, the very place where her accident had stolen her strength. Now, with the roan's warm breath against her arm, she realized she was no longer afraid. By the week's end, they shared supper with Mrs. Hollis and her boy, opening the jar of peaches at last. The talk stayed on ordinary things: weather, calves, the price of grain, but the house no longer felt silent or abandoned. Clara caught herself smiling at small moments, even laughing once at a story the boy told. She hadn't laughed without bitterness in nearly a year. For the audience, the ones who might still ask, this chapter gave the answer to the unspoken question: could the ranch be more than a place of survival? The truth had become clear. With Elias's steady presence and Clara's refusal to yield, it was not only surviving, but beginning to feel like home again. That night, when the lantern was trimmed low, Clara lay awake for a time, listening to the quiet of the house. Her hips ached from the day's work, but it was the ache of use, not of failure. In the lean-to, Elias shifted once, then settled. For the first time since her fall, Clara believed she had a future she could walk toward, one step at a time. Spring settled fully across the land, green pushing along the ditches Elias had cleared, the fences standing straight against the horizon. The ranch no longer looked like a place on the edge of collapse. It looked lived in, tended. Clara walked the yard each morning with her cane, her steps still careful, but no longer marked by fear. The goats pressed at the fence. The roan gelding moved steady in the corral. And for the first time since her fall, she felt her land answer her effort with life instead of defeat. One evening, they stood at the kitchen table with the ledger open. The columns were neat, the numbers black instead of red. Elias pointed at the next month's plans: when to sell, when to plant, when to cut hay. His voice carried certainty, not suggestion, as though he had already chosen to stay for each of those tasks. Clara looked at him then, seeing more than just a drifter passing through. The question she had carried since the day he rode up finally pressed against her chest. Would he leave when the season turned? Or was this place enough to hold him? She didn't ask it outright. Instead, she said, "Winter will come before we know it. Harder work then. A man can't sleep in a lean-to when the snow falls." Elias set the pencil down, met her eyes, and answered plain: "Then I won't. I'll sleep inside, if that sits well with you." The words struck her harder than she expected. No promises dressed in fancy talk. No declarations. Just a choice. He had chosen to stay. Her hand tightened on the ledger page. For a moment, fear whispered, fear of needing him too much, of giving up her pride. But then she thought of the empty months behind her, the silence of a house that had felt more like a tomb than a home. She swallowed and gave her answer: "It sits well." The decision came quickly after. No fuss, no spectacle. They rode into town on a clear morning, stood before the clerk, and signed the papers. 2 witnesses, a license folded into a drawer. No flowers, no church bells. Just bread and cheese eaten from the wagon seat afterward, the sun high and warm. Clara glanced at the ring on her finger. Plain, simple, fitting, and felt the weight of it settle not as a burden, but as a truth. Back at the ranch, they fell into their rhythm again. Stretches by the stove each morning, Elias mending tools in the evenings, Clara walking a little farther down the yard each day. The routines didn't change because of the paper they'd signed. They didn't need to. What had been fragile had turned into something steady, and steady was enough. For those who might still wonder whether Clara's pain would vanish, whether Elias's grief would disappear, the answer was clear. Her hips still ached, his eyes still carried shadows, but neither of them faced those things alone anymore. The questions of the first chapter, would she survive on her own, would he keep drifting forever, had been settled. She was no longer alone. He was no longer wandering. At dusk, Clara and Elias walked together to the cottonwood by the arroyo. The sun burned low, but not harsh, the air holding a quiet stillness. Clara stood with her feet set a little wider than weeks before. She didn't count breaths this time. She didn't need to. Elias stood close, his hand hovering near hers, not touching, just present. She felt steady on her own, but steadier because he was there. When they turned back toward the house, the porch lamp already glowing, Clara felt something she had thought lost to her forever. Peace. Not the peace of rest, but the peace of knowing tomorrow had shape and purpose. The ranch had work, their lives had work, and together they had chosen to stay. That night, as the lamp was turned down and the house settled into quiet, there were no doubts left, no questions unanswered. The woman who once feared she had been left behind by her own body, and the man who once feared staying anywhere had built something neither had dared hope for. Not just survival, but a family of two, strong enough to carry them forward. And in the silence of that house, with tomorrow waiting, their story found its end.